Let's start with a simple observation. When two governments stop talking to each other, they don't stop communicating. They just switch channels. A letter on an anniversary, a funeral delegation, a warship that suddenly appears where it wasn't invited. None of these are accidents, and none of them are really about what they claim to be about. So today I want to walk through a cluster of events that, taken individually, look like routine diplomatic noise, but taken together, tell a much more specific story about where this stands. I'll move through four theaters: Iran, Belarus, the Baltic, and the wider question of who is actually running the risk calculus in Europe right now. Stay with me, because the connections matter more than any single headline. Start in Tehran. The most senior Russian official to travel there since the war with Iran ended did so this week, and he did not go for a funeral alone. He holds two jobs that matter here, one ceremonial, one operational. Ceremonially, he represents Moscow at the burial of a man killed by an airstrike, and that alone sends a message. Russia is not distancing itself from Tehran, it is standing next to the grave. Operationally, he runs day-to-day oversight of Russia's military-industrial output. And it is not a coincidence, I want to be careful with that word, because coincidence gets thrown around too easily in this business, that in the days before his arrival, informal channels close to the Russian security establishment started talking, rather specifically, about advanced fighter jet production for Iran. Not vague promises, numbers, aircraft already built, a delivery window, a total order size. We have heard versions of this story before, for years, and each time it dissolved into nothing, so treat it with appropriate caution. But notice the pattern. The leak arrives exactly when the trip is arranged, not before, not after. That is not how genuine intelligence leaks behave. That is how a government signals intent without committing to it on paper. There is a second layer here too. Iran has a new supreme leader, and almost nothing is confirmed about his condition, his location, or even, depending on which rumor you credit, whether the public version of events involving him is accurate at all. A senior Russian official arriving in this vacuum, potentially the first foreign leader of any real stature to get access, is not a small thing. It tells you two governments still consider each other necessary, at a moment when a great many people in the West assumed Iran had been sufficiently isolated and weakened that this kind of visit wouldn't happen or wouldn't matter. It matters. Watch what comes out of it over the following weeks, not what's announced this week. Now to Belarus, because this is where the architecture becomes visible. On the anniversary marking Belarus's independence, the letter that arrived from Moscow was, on its surface, ceremonial boilerplate, warm words about shared history, about the liberation of Minsk during the Second World War, about fraternal bonds. Diplomatic letters like this are usually safe to skim. This one wasn't. Read past the pleasantries and there's a specific phrase: cooperation to counter external threats and challenges. That phrase is doing real work. What threats? Two, and they're not subtle. First, Ukraine has been putting direct pressure on Belarus, demanding it dismantle relay infrastructure that reportedly helps coordinate drone operations on Ukrainian territory, demanding it stop exporting oil products to Russia, and at moments appearing to demand that Belarus sever its economic relationship with Moscow altogether. That is an extraordinary ask to make of a sovereign government. And Minsk has responded by doing the opposite of complying, publicly telling a Ukrainian delegation that this kind of pressure is unacceptable, then almost immediately meeting Russian officials to reaffirm alignment. Second, and this is the part that gets underreported, there was a lengthy summit between the two heads of state, reportedly running 2 full days, at a residence that Russia has previously said was the target of an assassination attempt by drone. 2 days is not a photo opportunity. 2 days is a negotiation, almost certainly involving military planning staff on both sides. So when the anniversary letter talks about fruitful cooperation, coordinating efforts to counter external threats, it isn't nostalgia. It's a public marker laid down after a private agreement. Here's where I want to be careful, because the specifics matter and the sourcing matters. According to information from people outside Russia, not connected to the Russian state, who have a track record of being right about this kind of detail, there are on the order of 45,000 Russian troops already dispersed across Belarusian territory. Not a single unified force, spread out, embedded in training missions, embedded in infrastructure hardening. More significant, in my view, is what's happened to the Belarusian military itself. For years, the working assumption was that Belarus's army was a relic, Soviet-era equipment, low readiness, more a symbolic force than a serious one. That assumption appears to no longer hold. The standing force is still modest in size, something in the range of 20,000 ground troops, but it has reportedly been re-equipped to something closer to contemporary Russian standards, and Belarus maintains a mobilization system that could expand that number several-fold on short notice. And there's a template being discussed for how this would all activate, the Kursk incursion of August 2024. That episode is apparently treated in planning circles as the model for how Russia and Belarus would respond to any comparable push toward Minsk. I won't go further into what a contingency plan of that kind might contain. That's not analysis, that's operational detail, and I don't think it's responsible to speculate about it in public. The point to take from all this is simple. Belarus has quietly stopped being a symbolic ally and started being a forward operating theater. That is a change in kind, not just in degree. Now, at almost exactly the same moment, a story surfaced in the European press, originating in a Polish outlet with German ownership, then amplified through a well-known hawkish tabloid and a British broadsheet undergoing the same ownership change, claiming that the Polish president had been privately warned by American intelligence that Russia is preparing some kind of provocation against Poland. The nature of the alleged provocation is vague. Drones, missiles, possibly something more, with the door left open to a ground element. I want to walk through why I think this deserves real skepticism. Not because provocations are impossible, but because of how this story is constructed. First, sourcing. It comes from unnamed people said to be close to the Polish president, not from the American side, which is the more plausible origin point if American intelligence genuinely made this assessment. When a warning of this magnitude is real, it tends to surface first in the country whose intelligence services generated it. Here, it surfaced in outlets known for a specific editorial disposition on Russia. Second, timing and content. Only days earlier, the Russian president made a public statement to his own party Congress, a statement that is, frankly, unambiguous in its logic. NATO states have not yet launched missiles or drones from their own soil against Russia, he said, because they understand that doing so would trigger a Russian response against the launch points. That's a conditional, reactive threat. It is not the same statement as, "We are planning to strike Poland." But it is very easy to take a conditional warning and rewrite it in translation and repetition as an offensive plan. I think that's what happened here. Third, and this is the broader pattern I'd ask you to notice, stories of this shape tend to appear at moments when European governments want to pull the United States back into a firmer, more explicit commitment to Article 5. If you want Washington re-anchored to Europe's defense, a credible-sounding leak about an imminent Russian test of NATO's resolve is an effective instrument. I'm not asserting that's what happened. I'm saying the incentive structure lines up too neatly to ignore. Around the same time, a well-regarded British Defense Institute published research arguing that a wave of Russian drone incursions over NATO territory, some allegedly coordinated from vessels in the so-called Shadow Fleet, had been systematically probing gaps in European air defense. That claim about the gaps themselves isn't controversial. It's been public knowledge for well over a year that European air defense coverage is thin. What's less settled is the attribution of every incident. At least one widely cited case, drones over a major airport, was reportedly walked back by local reporting as unconfirmed. If that holds, it should make us more careful, not less, about accepting every incursion story on the fly. Then there's the piece that's harder to wave away, a reported confrontation at sea. A vessel belonging to a NATO member's Coast Guard approached a Russian-linked tanker in the Baltic. A Russian naval ship, reportedly a missile corvette, moved to intercept, issued a warning, and the Coast Guard vessel withdrew. This is not the first such episode. Months earlier, a similar standoff occurred involving an Estonian vessel and a commercial ship trading with Russia, resolved when Russian aircraft scrambled and the Estonian side backed off. I want to draw the through line here rather than treat this as an isolated maritime incident. If you connect the letter to Minsk, the troop buildup in Belarus, the reported summit and cooperation pact, the drone incursion narrative, and now a live naval confrontation, the picture is of two sides testing the edges of each other's tolerance in a region where a miscalculation carries outsized consequences. Kaliningrad sits on Poland's border. Belarus sits on Poland's border too, and on Ukraine's. Any serious clash in this theater does not stay contained to the two ships or the two aircraft involved. It draws in everything around it, fast. My own assessment, for what it's worth, attempting to test Russian resolve in the Baltic would be reckless. Whatever the symbolic value of NATO's expansion around that coastline, the underlying military geography still favors Russia enormously. A major naval base, substantial air power, missile range reaching from multiple directions. I don't say this to endorse anyone's aggression. I say it because I think a number of voices in European policy circles are underestimating what an actual clash there would look like, and overestimating what deterrence currently exists to prevent one. There's a quieter shift happening in parallel, and it concerns the European Union itself, not NATO. For months, Russian officials across several portfolios have been converging on the same argument, that the EU is no longer simply an economic bloc, but has become a military political actor in its own right, and that Ukraine's accession to it is therefore just as unacceptable to Moscow as NATO membership would be. Until recently, the Russian president himself had avoided saying this explicitly. That restraint appears to be ending. His spokesman has now stated plainly that the EU is transforming into a military, political, economic bloc, spending heavily on militarizing member economies, and that Russia is taking this transformation into account. When a president's spokesman uses language that specific, it is reasonable to assume it reflects the president's own thinking, not a rogue opinion. The practical implication: any diplomatic settlement that assumes Ukraine can simply pivot toward EU membership as a consolation for staying out of NATO is likely to run straight into this redefinition. Moscow appears to be closing that door before anyone has the chance to walk through it. Now to the number that, in my view, deserves more attention than it's getting. A reported buildup of roughly 170,000 Russian troops in Bryansk region, which borders Ukraine's Chernihiv region to the north. Ukraine's top military commander has said publicly that an order exists to eventually take Kyiv, and has connected that order to a possible advance from Bryansk into Chernihiv. I'd urge caution before assuming that's the immediate plan. Sourcing close to this buildup suggests the more likely near-term purpose is consolidation, extending Russian control across the northeast, widening what's sometimes called the buffer zone, and further stretching Ukrainian forces that are already under severe strain elsewhere along the line. But set the interpretation aside for a moment and just sit with the number. 170,000 troops, with a significant proportion of heavy, self-propelled artillery capable of reaching Chernihiv city from just across the border, is a force considerably larger than what Russia committed to the entire push on Kyiv back in the opening weeks of the war. Whatever the intended use, a force of that scale does not sit idle indefinitely. At some point, it moves. And when it does, however limited the stated objective, the psychological effect in Kyiv and across European capitals will be severe, arguably more severe than anything since the war's opening phase. On the front line itself, the pattern from recent weeks has been an acceleration, not a slowdown. Reports, again, treat specific multipliers with some skepticism, suggest the pace of the advance picked up substantially compared with the prior month. Positions around Lyman and Kostiantynivka continue the slow, methodical clearing operations that tend to follow any Russian capture of a built-up area. Further south, forces have reportedly pushed close enough to key fortified Ukrainian positions east of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk that footage from ground units, not drone reconnaissance, but soldiers on the ground, shows the Slovyansk thermal plant clearly visible on the horizon. That's a proximity marker, not a capture, but it tells you how close the fighting has come to what is widely regarded as one of the more defensible anchor points in the region. There's debate over whether the town of Mykolaiivka, sitting on lower ground than the high-terrain Russian forces reportedly now control, will be defended fiercely or will fall quickly once seriously contested. I don't have visibility into which is correct, and I'd treat confident predictions either way with suspicion. In the air, the pattern of exchange continues largely as before. A heavy combined drone and missile strike on Kyiv, followed by a Ukrainian retaliatory effort, several hundred drones launched at Russian territory, the majority intercepted, limited damage from those that got through, alongside a separate and reportedly more damaging set of strikes against targets in Crimea. I'd resist the framing, increasingly common, that this makes Crimea a strategic liability for Russia. Damage from drone strikes is real, but it hasn't been shown to degrade actual military capability there. By the same logic used to make that argument about Crimea, the much heavier strikes on Kyiv would make Kyiv itself an unsustainable liability for Ukraine, and almost nobody is willing to follow that logic to its conclusion. Be wary of arguments applied selectively. Underneath all of this sits a factor that I think explains more of the current nervousness in Europe than most commentary credits. A growing sense that the United States is quietly disengaging from its historic role as Europe's guarantor. The American president has continued to publicly question the fairness of an arrangement where the U.S. commits unconditionally to defending European NATO members who, in his framing, were notably absent when Washington needed support during its recent confrontation with Iran. This is consistent with a long-standing position of his, that European allies have underinvested in their own defense while assuming American backup is guaranteed. My own reading is that this is, at least in significant part, a pressure tactic intended to push Europe toward buying more of its own weapons, largely from American suppliers, rather than a genuine plan to abandon the alliance outright. But I think many observers underestimate how unsettling this rhetoric actually is to European planners, and here's why. Consider the position European governments have put themselves in. They have spent years antagonizing Russia diplomatically. They have backed an open-ended conflict in Ukraine that, however loudly denied in public, most serious planners privately understand is not going well. Their own defense industrial base is, by most honest internal assessments, unable to produce weapons at the scale a serious confrontation with Russia would require. Their standing militaries are, in relative terms, not currently positioned to prevail in a conventional war against a larger and more combat-experienced Russian force. And they did all of this while assuming that if matters ever became serious, the United States would step in. Now the president of that United States is publicly questioning whether that assumption still holds. At the same moment, a recent U.S.-Iran confrontation has, in the eyes of many outside observers, demonstrated the limits of American power more clearly than expected. Put those pieces together and you get something close to genuine fear in European capitals. And fear, historically, doesn't produce careful policy. It produces overreaction, sometimes toward appeasement, but just as often toward escalation, on the theory that it's better to force a confrontation now, while some American backing still exists, than to wait until it doesn't. None of this is an argument for militarization or for provoking a wider war. If anything, it's the opposite. The logical response to this level of mutual fear should be a serious diplomatic effort on both sides. But diplomacy requires someone willing to sit across the table. And at the moment, I don't see European governments, as opposed to the Ukrainians and the Americans, who are at least nominally in contact with Moscow, showing any appetite for that at all. One more thread, because it tends to get lost beneath the military headlines. The legal fight over frozen Russian central bank assets is intensifying. A Moscow arbitration court has ruled in Russia's favor in a case brought against the European settlement institution holding those frozen funds. In response, that institution has reportedly opened a countersuit in Belgian courts, apparently attempting to offset whatever judgment Moscow might try to enforce. I'll be honest about the limits of my own understanding here. I haven't seen the actual pleadings on either side. And legal proceedings like this often turn on details that don't make it into public reporting. But the broader signal is unmistakable. European institutions are treating the Russian legal threat seriously enough to mount a defense in multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. That is not the behavior of an institution confident the matter will simply disappear. Expect this fight to run in parallel with the military and diplomatic tracks for a long time, and expect it to become its own source of friction between Moscow and Brussels. So let's pull the threads together. A senior Russian official cementing ties with Iran at a moment of maximum vulnerability for Tehran. A ceremonial letter to Minsk that's actually a public marker for a private military agreement. A Belarusian army quietly transformed from symbolic to substantial. A Western media narrative about an imminent Russian provocation that, on close inspection, looks more like an attempt to re-anchor American commitment than a genuine intelligence warning. A real naval confrontation in the Baltic that shows both sides are willing to test each other at sea. 170,000 troops sitting on a border they haven't yet crossed. And underneath all of it, a growing and largely justified fear in European capitals that the American security guarantee they've built their entire strategy around may not be as solid as they assumed. I don't think any of this makes a wider war inevitable, but I think it makes clear that the current trajectory, more deployments, more leaks, more naval standoffs, and essentially zero real diplomatic contact is not a stable equilibrium. It's the kind of situation that tends to resolve itself one of two ways: through an actual negotiation that nobody currently seems willing to start, or through an incident that forces one. I would very much prefer the former. I'm not confident that's the direction this is heading. That's where I'll leave it for now. More as this develops.